Well, hello there. Today I'm going to talk about Ronald Reagan, Republican president from 1981 to 1989. So let me start with talking about the pictures here. The one on the left is a movie poster, Bedtime for Bonzo, and Bonzo was a chimpanzee, as you see there, and Ronald Reagan was the human star of this movie. And he was a movie star before he was president, long before he was president. And he mostly starred in like B-type movies, kind of silly movies like this one, nothing too serious. It's not like he was ever nominated for an Oscar or anything for the work that he was doing in film. But that kind of led him into politics because he became president of the Screen Actors Guild, which is the union that represents actors. Eventually, he'll become the governor of California and then go on to be president. The picture you see on the right-hand side in the top there, it's from a book about Ronald Reagan, and he was known as the great communicator, and he was really able to use his skills as an actor to be a very convincing and charismatic speaker. The picture that you're going to see at the bottom right there is right after he is leaving a speech. He was speaking to some members of the AFL-CIO, and as he was leaving, he was shot. And this is in 1981, just a couple months after his inauguration. 6 shots were fired that day by a man named John Hinckley Jr. And John Hinckley Jr. was a mentally unstable young man who was obsessed with the actress Jodie Foster, and to get her attention, because the years of stalking hadn't worked, he just came up with a plan to shoot the president. He was actually going to shoot Jimmy Carter originally, but that didn't work out, and so eventually it was Ronald Reagan. So it wasn't really about Reagan so much as gaining this attention through this, a bizarre act. He did shoot Reagan. Reagan got shot in the chest, but he would be okay. Much more seriously injured was Reagan's press secretary, James Brady. He was shot and paralyzed, and he would go on to become a somebody who advocated for gun control. Anyway, John Hinckley was found guilty by reason of insanity, and he has served his time since then in various mental institutions. So in 1980, Reagan runs. He runs against Jimmy Carter, who we've talked about previously, and Carter, although a really great guy, not so good and effective as a president. So Reagan ushered in, a kind of new era. He was a Republican, and the agenda of the party was try to return the country to kind of a simpler time. Decreasing taxes was a big part of their agenda, creating smaller government, having a very strong military, and conservative moral values. And if you think about it, during the 60s, we saw what many people would consider a deterioration of moral values, which continued through the 1970s. And so Reagan and the Republicans are trying to create a return to that. So you can see the poster here on the right, Reagan for president, let's make America great again. Let's try to return to this period where America is this world leader, where we have these more traditional values returned to, and usher in a simpler time. So Reagan, as a Republican, was a conservative, and so the conservative agenda, it incorporated many different things. First of all, one thing that Reagan wanted to address was entitlement programs. So entitlement programs mean they're guaranteed benefits to a specific group of people. They are things that people believe they are entitled to, essentially, simply just by being Americans, basically. Social Security would be a big example of this. But the high cost of many of these programs, stories of fraud, like welfare fraud and such, upset taxpayers, so many of them wanted to see some of these programs cut. Affirmative action was another program, and I've talked about this when I talked about the civil rights movement, how it created favoritism for certain groups getting hired or getting into colleges, and many people said it was reverse discrimination, and so there was a lot of controversy over it during this period. The moral majority is a term you should be familiar with from Reagan's time in office. These are fundamentalist Christians. They condemn liberal attitudes. A lot of that has its roots in the Roe versus Wade decision in the early 1970s, and that decision kind of created and coalesced this group of people who wanted to see that case overturned, and that kind of became the basis of this moral majority. The New Right was a group of conservative special interest groups. They seemed to be particularly interested in kind of returning America to this strong economy it had had previously, and they believed that regulations on businesses regarding, environmental concerns and labor concerns, those were undermining the free enterprise system, and they were kind of making America less competitive on the global market, so they kind of wanted to see some of those changes rolled back. The picture you're seeing here, this is Pat Robertson. He would definitely be somebody representing the moral majority. He was known as a televangelist. He still has a program on TV today, the 700 Club, you might have come across, and that's, he's a very fundamentalist, right-wing Christian voice, and you would see many people like that during the 80s in particular. Now, Reagan's approach to economics would be known as Reaganomics, and more accurately, supply-side economics. So the idea here was to reduce taxes, and when you reduce taxes and people aren't paying so much in taxes, that's going to give individuals incentives to invest. So the idea is that if individuals are investing in businesses, perhaps, or the businesses themselves are having their taxes cut, so they're able to invest in new labor and machinery and such. Eventually, the money will trickle down from the wealthy to the poor. So that's also known as trickle-down theory. So it was individuals as well as businesses that had their taxes cut, and this was believed that, all of that would trickle down to the working class, and that would enable them to be able to consume more goods and buy more things, and therefore it would be this wonderful cycle that would create a stronger economy in the United States. And most economists now realize it didn't quite work out that way. He also wanted to cut the budget, so the amount of money that the government is spending. And one way he did that was by cutting some entitlement programs. Now, the entitlement programs he kept would be programs that benefited the middle class. Social Security and Medicare, he didn't want to touch those programs. The ones that got cut were those that tended to benefit the poor urban population, particularly like school lunch programs and such. Despite these attempts, the national debt continued to climb, and a lot of that had to do with defense spending. And of course, you know about the Cold War, and this is kind of a period where we're seeing the Cold War eventually going to wind down by the end of the decade. And a lot will say it's because of the amount of money that we were spending in defense, which the Soviet Union just would not be able to match. Now, one costly and interesting idea that Reagan wanted to pursue was something that came to be known by the name of Star Wars. And it came to be known by that name because Star Wars was a popular series of films, at the time. Now, the defense spending that I mentioned previously had pretty much doubled during the 1980s. And Reagan wanted to continue to spend more money on both nuclear and conventional weapons, as well as to have scientists develop something called the Strategic Defense Initiative, or SDI, and Star Wars was its nickname. Essentially, it would be an orbiting satellite shield to intercept and destroy Soviet missiles. And you can see in the picture there, it's showing missiles that are being fired, and then it shows this one orbiting satellite being able to fire at those missiles and essentially knock them out of the sky, basically, before they reach their destination. And some money was spent to develop this, but eventually it was abandoned because it was quite expensive, and many thought it really couldn't be achieved. So now I'm going to talk about some other domestic issues going on in the country. First of all, farmers have been suffering throughout the whole century. And the 1980s was no different. So the government was still paying farmers not to grow crops. So the subsidies that they had been paying going back, decades essentially. The problem was still overproduction, and the rising costs of running these farms led to a decrease in profits, and so farmers are suffering. They're going to see foreclosures going on and things like that. That will actually lead a group of musicians in 1985 to a concert called Farm Aid. It was based on an idea of a concert a year earlier, in 1984, called Live Aid, which basically, was this huge kind of festival type concert. It was broadcast on MTV. People could call in and pledge money basically to world hunger during the Live Aid concerts. And so the Farm Aid concerts in 1985 were patterned off of that, and it's raised since then millions of dollars to kind of help family farmers stay on their land to avoid foreclosures and such. Another issue going on was immigration. There was an act passed in 1986 which forbade employers from hiring illegal immigrants. It was to try to deal with the problem of illegal immigration, particularly Mexican immigrants. An important Supreme Court appointment will be Sandra Day O'Connor, who you see pictured there. She was the first woman Supreme Court justice. It took until the 1980s for that to happen. We have several others since then, though. Some other Reagan and then eventually Bush Sr., who comes after Reagan, appointments made the court more conservative, which shouldn't surprise us because both Reagan and Bush were Republicans and conservative in their appointments. Another big domestic issue going on in the country was the air traffic controllers strike. So in 1981, air traffic controllers, those guys who control the takeoff, the landing, the planes in flight at every airport, were seeking higher salaries, fewer working hours, something that a lot of people in labor wanted throughout the years. And unfortunately, as employees of the federal government, their strike violated federal law, which stated that federal employees could not strike. So Reagan announced that the striking controllers must return to their jobs within 48 hours or be fired, and he was not bluffing. So he fired more than 11,000 air traffic controllers. He replaced them with air traffic controllers from the military who had worked, in the Air Force or Navy, supervisors who were not part of the union and therefore weren't striking, and any workers who chose not to go on strike, and he banned the striking workers from being rehired. So he was definitely going to keep his word regarding firing those air traffic controllers. And so this is kind of, a controversial move. It was definitely a blow to labor in this country. Obviously, the government was not siding with the workers in this particular situation. So I just want to take a little bit of a break and show you guys some things from pop culture in the 1980s. And this really excites me because this is my decade, So on the top left there, we've got the Rubik's Cube. That was lots of fun. You can still get those today. And then we got MTV, and MTV started in the 80s. And they used to actually play music videos, which was really cool at the time. Now they just play like really silly shows like Jersey Shore and such. I know, you guys know. Then on the bottom left there, we've got Born in the USA by The Boss, Bruce Springsteen, really famous song and album from the 80s. Then we've got a picture of Michael Jackson, and his Thriller album came out in the 80s too. And then above that, we've got a cassette tape. So a mixtape used to actually be a tape. And then we've got Pac-Man there. Some of you might have played that game. And then on the upper right there, we have a scene, still from a scene from a movie that was popular in the 1980s. And if you are one of the first 5 people to email me the name of that movie, you will get extra credit. But you can email me, but then the next day you have to come in and you have to show me, or as soon as possible, you have to come in and show me that you have notes from this PowerPoint and that you just didn't, get that one piece of information and nothing else. So first 5 people to email me, make sure you show me your printed out notes or your notes on Google Slides or whatever with comments filled in as soon as you can so that you actually do get your extra credit. So again, I want to know the name of that movie that you see a picture of on the upper right hand side there. So in 1984, Ronald Reagan will be up for re-election, and running against him for the Democrats will be Walter Mondale. Walter Mondale had served as Carter's vice president from 1977 until 1981. He also had experience serving in the Senate, and he's going to be, as I said, running for the Democrats. Now, he will choose Geraldine Ferraro as his running mate. She was the first woman on a major party's presidential ticket, so if they had won, she would have been the first female vice president. And interestingly enough, we haven't had one yet. Reagan and Bush, his running mate, won by a landslide. Apparently, people in the country liked what Reagan was doing, and many liked the direction that the country was going in, at least enough to get Reagan reelected, that is. All right, so one last slide regarding domestic agenda and policies during Reagan's administration. We're going to talk about some health issues, particularly AIDS. So immune-acquired deficiency syndrome first appeared, or was reported, I should say, in the press in 1981. It was kind of a mysterious disease. People didn't really understand how it was being transmitted at first, and so the press picks up on this and begins writing about it in 1981. And throughout the 1980s, this epidemic increased, particularly because a lot of people didn't yet know exactly how it was spread. You had it spread amongst people who were getting blood transfusions frequently, such as hemophiliacs, but you also had it very strong in the gay community as well. So it was originally known as GRID, gay-related immune deficiency, but a lot of people, particularly families of children who were hemophiliacs who got this disease through blood transfusions, didn't like that particular term for it, so it became acquired immune deficiency syndrome, referring to the fact that it could have been acquired in various ways. So there was increasing concern throughout the 80s over how to prevent this disease, if there would be a cure possible for the disease. And Reagan gets a lot of criticism because he didn't mention AIDS until 1987. First reported in the press in 1981. The president doesn't even talk about it until 1987. So this little picture you have here, this kind of refers to this criticism of Reagan for his kind of ignoring of the AIDS crisis. It says thousands of Americans died of AIDS under my watch. I did nothing. I wouldn't even mention the name of the disease in public for fear of offending religious bigots. And it's believed that, this tie he had to this moral majority and the religious right precluded him from speaking about this because it was stigmatized as a gay disease, essentially, in that period of time. And that's why Reagan largely ignored it. Regarding abortion, we know that the battle intensified throughout the 1980s, especially as the moral majority gained strength and momentum. In 1989, the Supreme Court ruled that states may place more restrictions on abortion, particularly like when an abortion can be, considered legal, against second trimester abortions and things like that. And one more thing is regarding drug abuse. First Lady Nancy Reagan, because we know the first ladies like to have some sort of cause they're working on. Well, her cause was Just Say No. It was a Just Say No to Drugs campaign. Just say no. Don't do it. Don't try it. That was basically the message here. Mostly this campaign was not considered particularly effective, obviously. A lot of people continue to do drugs and still do drugs. So anyway, that's the domestic policies under Reagan. Next time I will be talking about foreign policy under Ronald Reagan, particularly the end of the Cold War.